Like, how hard is that calculation, where to place the shelter?
If you're like dropped off and this is all new to you, of course, all those things are going to be things you have to really think through and plan. When you're thinking about a shelter, you have to think of, oh, here's a nice flat spot. That's a good place. But also, is there firewood nearby? And if I'm going to be here for months, is there enough firewood that I'm not going to be walking a half a mile to get a dry piece of wood? Is the water nearby? Is it somewhat open, but also protected from the elements? Because sometimes you get a beautiful spot. Oh, it is great on a calm day, and then the wind comes like, and so there's all these factors, even down to taking in what game is doing in the area also, and how that relates to where your shelter is.
You said you have to consider where the action will be, and you want to be away from the action, but close enough to it.
To see it. Yeah, you want to be, yeah, right. And so, ideally, and it depends. You're always going to make give and takes. And one thing with shelters and location selection and stuff, that's another thing. You just have to trust your ability to adapt in the situation, because everybody has a particular, you got an idea of a shelter you're going to build, but then you get there and maybe there's a good cliff that you can incorporate, and then you just become creative. And that's a really fun process too, to just allow your creativity to try to flourish in that.
What kind of shelters are there?
There's all kinds of philosophies on shelters, which is fun. It's fun to see people try different things. Mine was fairly basic for the simple reason that I'd lived, through winters in Siberia in a teepee. So I knew I didn't need like anything too robust. As long as I had calories, I'd be warm, and I wasn't particularly worried about the cold. But you'll see. So I kept my shelter really pretty simple, with the idea that I built a simple A-frame type shelter, and then most of my energy is going to be focused on getting calories. And then, of course, there's always going to be downtime. And in that downtime, I can tweak, modify, improve my shelter, and that'll just be a constant process that by the time you're there a few months, you'll have all of the kinks worked out. It'll be a really nice little setup, but you don't have to start with that necessarily, because you got other needs you got to focus on. That said, you'll see a lot of people on a loan that really focus on, building a log cabin because they want to be secure, or incorporating the, whatever the earth has around, whether it be rocks or whether it be digging a hole, and we've seen some really cool shelters, and I'm not gonna knock it. There's all different strokes for different folks, but my particular idea was to keep it fairly simple, improve it with time, but spend most of my energy. With a shelter, you really need to think about, it can't be smoky because that'll be miserable, but it is nice to have a fire inside. So you need to have a fire inside that's not going to be dangerous, and smoke free, and then also airtight, because you're never going to have a warm shelter out there because you don't have seals and things like that. But as long as the air's not moving through it, you can have a warm enough shelter.
With a fire.
With a fire and dry your socks and stuff.
How do you get the smoke out of the shelter?
If you have good clay and mud and rock, you can build yourself a fireplace, which is surprisrisingly not that hard. You just,
oh, really?
Yeah, it's a fun thing to do. It works well. Dig a little hole, start stacking rocks around it, make sure there's an opening, and it actually works. So that's not as hard as you might think. For me, where I was, I kind of came up with it as I was there with my A-frame. I hadn't built an A-frame shelter like that before. And so when I built it, and then I had put a bunch of tin cans in the ground so that air would get the fire. So it was fed by air, which helps create a draft. But I realized in an A-frame, it really doesn't, the smoke doesn't go out very well. Even if you leave a hole at the top, it like collects and billows back down. So then I cut some of my tarp and made this, and cut a hole in the A-frame, and then I made like a hood vent that I could pull down and catch the smoke with. And so while the fire was going, it would just billow out the hood vent, and then when it was done burning and was just hot coals, I could close it, seal it up, and keep the heat in. So it actually worked pretty well.
So start with something that kind of works and then keep improving.
Yeah, exactly.
I was wondering, the log cabin, it feels like that's a thing that takes a huge amount of work before work.
The difference between a log cabin and a warm log cabin is like an immense amount of work, and all the chinking and all the door sealing, and the chimney has to be anyway. So otherwise, it's just going to be the same ambient temperature as outside. So I don't think alone's the proper context for a log cabin. I think like a log cabin's great in as a hunting cabin, as you know, like if you're gonna have something for years, but in a 3-6 month scenario, I don't know that it's worth the calorie expenditure.
And it is a lot of calories. But that's an interesting sort of metaphor of just like get something that works. You see a lot of this with companies, like successful companies. They get a prototype, get a system that's working, and then improve fast in response to the conditions, to the environment.
Yeah, because it's constantly changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you end up being a lot better if you're able to learn how to respond quickly, versus like having a big plan that takes a huge amount of time to accomplish. That's
right, and forcing that through the pipeline, whether or not it fits. Yeah.